I'm back, and I have another oldie but a goodie. This is so old, this book, that it actually has my maiden name. That means the name before I got married. So I wasn't Mrs. Kiefer then, I was Miss Powella. And it says property of Miss Patricia Powella. This is a great one. This is one of Miss Young's favorites. So her kids have heard it, but the rest of you have not. It's called Noisy Nancy Norris. An alliteration, right? Here we go. Nancy Norris was a very noisy child. She liked to ride her stick horse and pound the end of it on the floor. Nancy liked to clomp down the hall in her mother's high-heeled shoes. She liked to sit on the radiator cover and bang her feet. She thumped her clay so hard that the table shook. Sometimes she made great clattering feet out of her mother's cake pans. Her pretend games were always noisy. When she was a garbage man, she banged two big pans together, making almost as much noise as a real garbage man. When she was a fireman, she made a noise that sounded like a siren. When she was an elephant, she made great clattering feet out of her mother's cake pans. And of course, she sang and talked most of the day. Sometimes when Nancy had been especially noisy, was talking a long time, her mother would say, "Nancy, please be quiet so I can think." Nancy tried to be quiet, but it was very difficult. Do you all have a problem like that sometimes? I wonder. Now, Nancy lived in an apartment house, and her noises often disturbed her neighbors. Now, Nancy lives in the city, and this is the way a lot of people in the city have to live, in big apartment houses. That doesn't happen in Upper Dublin, but in the city, that's the way people live. Her friend Sally lived on the floor above, and Nancy used to go to the stairway and call up to her, "Sally!" But Nancy's mother put a stop to that. Mrs. Muffle, who owned the whole building, lived in the apartment just below the Norrises. That's Nancy's family's name. When Nancy hopped down the hall like a kangaroo, the chandelier in Mrs. Muffle's hall tinkled. When Nancy jumped off her bed, there was a thud over Mrs. Muffle's head. Uh-oh. Not good, not good. On days when Nancy was especially noisy, Mrs. Muffle would get a broom and bang on her ceiling so that Nancy would hear the bang on her floor. Nancy thought that was very funny, and she would get a block and bang back. But Nancy's mother would be cross. That's another way of saying she was upset. "You are disturbing poor Mrs. Muffle," she would say. "Why don't you finger paint?" But Nancy even made a crackle slush sound with the paints and paper. Then came the bad day. It was raining when Nancy woke up, and she felt cross, so she sang, "Bad morning to you, bad morning to you." But she didn't really sing. She shouted. Then she stood on her bed and jumped to the floor. While she was getting dressed, she dropped her shoes one after the other and slammed the door 5 times. She rattled a stick against the wall as she ran down the hall to the kitchen, and she scraped her chair out from under the table and knocked it over. While she was eating breakfast, she tapped her spoon on her plate until her father asked her to stop. After breakfast, she picked up the wastebasket and drummed on it while she sang and marched through the living room. She was still marching when the doorbell rang. Who do you think it is? Nancy rushed to the door, and there was Mrs. Muffle. "Where are your parents?" she demanded. Mother and Daddy said, "Good morning, and how are you?" and all the polite things that grown-ups say. Mrs. Muffle didn't answer them. She just glared at Nancy and said, quietly of course, "I have had all the noise I can take. You will have to move unless I have complete peace and quiet from now on." She walked out without even saying goodbye. Nancy and Mother and Daddy sat staring at the door, which closed quietly behind Mrs. Muffle. "Oh my," moaned Mother. "Did you hear what she said?" asked Daddy. "I know it will be difficult, Nancy, but you must be quiet or we will have to move. Out, away from your friends and your playground, maybe even out of the city." Nancy nodded and tiptoed to her room and sat on the bed. She was still sitting there, thinking and doing nothing, when Daddy came to kiss her goodbye before he went to his office. Nancy just said goodbye. Then Mother came to tell her that she was going out and that Grandma would stay with her. Grandma came and Mother went. "Come out to the living room and talk with me, Nancy," Grandma called. Nancy said, "How are you, dear?" "Fine," she whispered. "Did you go to the playground yesterday?" "Yes," said Nancy. "What did you do?" "Played." "Is something the matter?" asked Grandma. "You seem very quiet." "No," said Nancy. Grandma read her a story, and then Nancy went to her room and looked at picture books. When Nancy's mother came home, Grandma told her that there was something wrong with Nancy. "I've been here for almost 2 hours and she hasn't said more than a few words. She hasn't jumped. She hasn't run." As soon as Grandma went home, Mother took Nancy's temperature. "No fever," she said. "Do you feel okay?" Nancy shook her head. She was quiet all day. She played with her puzzles, but she didn't even click the pieces. She played elephant, but she pretended to be walking on long green grass. She undressed all her dolls and wrapped them in blankets and put them to bed. When Daddy came home, she started to run down the hall to greet him. Then she remembered and tiptoed the rest of the way. When it was time for dinner, she pulled out her chair quietly. "What have you been doing today?" Daddy said. "Playing," said Nancy. "Did you have fun?" Nancy shrugged her shoulders. Then Mother and Daddy started talking to each other while Nancy ate everything on her plate. "My, but you finished quickly," said Daddy. "That's because she hasn't been talking," said Mother. Nancy went to bed quietly. Of course, she slept quietly. When she woke in the morning, she started to sing, "Good morning." Then she remembered Mrs. Muffle's visit and she didn't finish. Later in the morning, Nancy and her mother went to the playground. Sally was climbing on the monkey bars. "Hi, Nancy," she shouted. Nancy just waved to her and snuggled closer to her mother. She watched Michael and John playing on the slide. "Go play with them," said Mother, "and make noise. This is the place for it." Nancy thought a minute. Then she made a great and ran toward the slide. She climbed to the top, clanged her feet, and slid down, bumping into John, who was sitting on the bottom. Uh-oh, that's a no-no. When Nancy rode on the back of Michael's trike, they pretended it was a fire engine, and she made her best siren noises. They played garbage man, making loud clatters with their sand pails. Nancy and her mother Nancy made noise all morning and talked to her mother all the way home. But the minute they entered the apartment house door, she stopped talking and didn't say a word in the elevator or as they walked down the hall to their door. See, they have elevators in those big buildings. Right in front of the door was a box with an envelope on top with Nancy's name on it. Nancy opened the box. It was filled with cookies. Mother read the letter to Nancy. Dear Nancy, but it's been quiet down here. Almost too quiet. I hope you're not sick. Please make just a little noise so I'll know you are all right. Sincerely, Mrs. Muffet. Nancy smiled. Then she began to laugh. It would be so much easier to make a little noise than to make no noise at all. She picked up her stick horse and galloped to her room, remembering not to bang the end of the stick on the floor. The end. An oldie but a goodie. Hope you liked it.